Welcome to another episode of the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Jason.
And my name is Doyle.
My name is Dan.
Cool. So, as ever, we will kick off with a discussion about the games we have been playing recently. Doyle, you're joining us for the first time, so
yes,
why don't you
indeed.
get started?
Well, thank you guys for asking me to show up and everything.
Of course. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely. But I was... those of you who are listening probably don't know this, but there's a substantial amount of effort that goes into preparing for the show. For example, I had to fill out several questionnaires, one of which included a list of what I've been playing. So we did this collaboratively online, of course, these guys being the wonderfully technologically adept people that they are. And so I put my list of stuff down, and then they put their list of stuff down. And I thought, oh my God, when I looked at it. Because under Dan's list, there was nothing there, and I didn't know why. He told me later why there was nothing there. And there's like 2 things, maybe 3 under Jason's list. And there are several things. There are 7 or 8 things.
You have a lot of things here.
On my list.
This is a big list.
I also said, oh my God, when I looked at the outline and saw your list.
When I'm about to recite this list to you, I'm going to explain a little bit why it's not quite as bad as it looks or sounds.
All right, very good. There are a lot of games here. Like if I'm just looking at this list, Doyle, I would venture, not having the context of how and when you play these things,
right?
I would venture that you do nothing but play role-playing games in your life. Like that's all you do.
Yeah, it does seem like that. I know it does seem like that, and certainly my family certainly thinks this, but no, it's not quite. Absolutely true. Anyway, so on Monday night, I have been playing RuneQuest 3, an old school game set in Glorantha. I was the GM for that. That is ending. And if any of my friends who play in that game listen to this podcast, this is probably their first notification that it's probably ending. Because it's been ending for several weeks now. We haven't been getting together at all.
Yeah.
And my priorities and time allotments are shifting. And so, going on from there, on Tuesday nights, I was playing in a 3.5 game with a group of friends.
Now, I'm so sorry.
Yes. I was too. I played in this game because my friends wanted me to play with them. And, I didn't attend as often as I should have. I missed a lot of their games, unfortunately. And I have to say that was probably my unconscious dragging me back from the abyss.
The abyss of 3.5.
So, Joe, if you're listening, sorry about that. But anyway, we started playing something that I'm running. It's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition, which is the Fantasy Flight version of Warhammer, which was castigated because it had tons of huge amounts of bits. It was very expensive, and it was a lot like a board game.
I remember that about it, yeah.
So I bought a lot more of that stuff than I should have, and so I really wanted to use it rather than actually selling it like a lot of my other collection that I've been selling recently. So I'm just started to do that. We did character generation, and it took a hideous amount of time last night. It took like 3 hours to do like 4 characters. So
doesn't sound too bad, really. I mean,
oh God, no.
I mean, that's definitely. I mean, that's like a whole like story arc for the games we play, but
right.
That's exactly right. Yes, comparatively, it's hideous. So so moving on, I play on a Thursday night game with a bunch of people online, and I'm just a player in that. It's Gamma World 1st Edition.
Nice.
Great group of old school guys. They're all like my age or a little bit younger, and we talk as much about old games as we do play Gamma World or anything else. So that's really cool. On Friday night, I technically am running a Wilderlands game for people in my neighborhood and some friends from Houston. I live kind of way out of Houston. And that's really intermittent because it's a live game, and we don't always have the schedules that sync up. People have kids, responsibilities, etc.
So do you mostly play online games like Hangouts and Roll20?
These days, in the last year or so, it's been mostly G+.
Yeah, the technology is so good, though. Oh, man. I think that's really... I think Hangouts and Roll20 have, like, exploded the hobby in a big way, you know? But
I certainly hope so, and that's one of the things I'm actually going to touch on a little bit later. So, on Saturday, I play another online game on G+, DCC RPG.
Oh, Dungeon Crawl Classics, just so people
Classics,
know. Yeah.
That's right, so you'll know out there. And then on Sunday, I play very early in the morning. Well, early for me anyway, it's 11 o'clock, and a DCC game. And then I have an alternating game that I run online. It's either Pendragon or it's DCC RPG. It used to be Carcosa. Lamentations, Flame Princess version of Carcosa. So the thing is, these games don't make all that often. Okay. There's always gaps. So I usually play about 2 or 3 times a week. And I've done this deliberately. I want to say about 8 or so years ago, I decided that I was going to play. I wasn't going to let nothing get in my way.
Good for you.
I wasn't going to let people not showing up getting in my way. I was going to play 2 or 3 times a week, no matter what. And what that has amounted to, effectively, practically, is for me to schedule a huge amount of games.
Right.
Half of which don't make.
Just to make sure that something sticks.
Just to make sure that something sticks.
Nice.
So,
like it.
I still have a life. I still have responsibilities. I actually am trying to get into grad school, so I don't have a job right now. I haven't had a job for about 1.5 years or so since I got out of graduating finally from college.
Sure, yeah.
But I'm hoping very quickly to get back into grad school because I'm going crazy.
So on your list, you have Pendragon.
Yes, alternating.
Okay, yeah, I'm really jealous. I want to play Pendragon really badly.
I will be happy to run Pendragon, and anytime a slot opens up in the schedule, I'm looking significantly now at Dan.
So question. All right, so this came up on the previous podcast, Pendragon did, and I was just speculating. I don't know if it's true.
Okay.
But I know that one of the things that happens in Pendragon is that you're periodically your characters, like heirs, become your new character, right?
That's correct.
That's like a sort of a generational thing.
Right.
Do you sometimes get an heir who has a slack jaw and an overbite and or is underdeveloped in some way? Do you get the seed is not strong type heir? Yes. Can that happen in the game?
That does happen, but very rarely because a lot of people die in Pendragon.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's very difficult to establish a family.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So that was always one of the selling points.
Yeah, that was the selling point, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. But it's a precious thing. It's like an artifact in a regular D&D sort of game, or I don't know.
It's a rarity.
It's a rarity, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's hard to do, or at least it has been in the campaigns that I've run in the past.
Okay.
And so what happens is, technically, according to the rules, if you generate a son or an heir, a daughter, it could be,
right, yeah.
and they get to the age of majority where you can actually play them, they're supposed to have the same emotional stats that you do. They have the same personality traits and they have the same passions.
Right.
And if you've played a character that long, chances are your personality traits and passions are maxed out to pretty much the way you want them to be.
Okay.
So that by the time the character actually reaches the age of play, it's already been a little bit power gamed almost.
Oh, I see.
Okay. Now, I'm certain because it happens so rarely, I've never felt the need to introduce a sort of random element to introduce the fact that there might be flaws in these children.
Right.
Because they are so precious that you don't want to screw it up for the players.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But if it were more common, and it might be in later phases of the campaign, which I haven't been able to run, then that is absolutely something I'm going to steal from you and screw around my players with.
I don't know. Something about that just really appeals to me. This idea of
absolutely.
Oh man, I got a shit one.
Right.
Yeah.
This one's just total crap. Like the line may not even continue after this guy.
And just very briefly, that is the most interesting thing about Pendragon. When you get to the later phases, and I've only touched on a little bit this, but I've read and heard a lot about other people who have. When you get to the later phases, it's a really screwed up environment. I don't know if you've read Mort to Arthur or any of the other source material.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, but when you get to the later phases of the campaign, Mordred is setting up tournaments where they deliberately have a sort of no rebated weapons rule, so that they're actually killing each other in the tournaments, which is really antithetical to most of the Arthurian sort of ethos.
Okay,
about your fellow gentlemen. You're supposed to be fighting your fellow gentlemen, and you're not supposed to be really killing them.
Sure,
you're supposed to be getting better. And so there's all sorts of messed up stuff that happens because of the development of the campaign and the way just the game mechanics have impacted on it. Because you have tons of relatives and children when you get to the later phases of the campaign.
Right.
So much so that when plagues come, you welcome the chance to thin out your family trees. And you have so much wealth, but there's no chance to gain glory.
I love it.
There's no more wars, which is where the big glory is found, and there's nothing to advance. Your characters are kind of stuck as perpetual adolescents.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that feeds directly into Mordred, because he goes to all those perpetual adolescents and says, we've been denied our rightful glory. We should take it.
Okay.
So they're like the rich kids of Instagram.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
That's pretty good, Dan. That's good.
Exactly.
That's good.
You know, and so that's one of the more beautiful things about Pendragon, among many,
Cool.
I should point
Awesome.
out. So.
Dan, what have you been playing recently?
All right, so my list, as previously mentioned, is huge. I was out of town for all of last week, which is why we had the bonus episode instead of actually having a recorded show last week. But the one thing I was able to scrape together that is mildly relevant to role-playing games is while I was in Las Vegas, I played the Dungeons & Dragons slot machine, which is a thing
I love
you
it.
wouldn't expect.
It's so good.
And the funny thing is, it's everywhere. So,
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Multiple casinos, like giant Dungeons and Dragons, like big red dragon on top.
Oh, wow.
And like
Okay.
kind of poorly modeled knights and elves walking all over these slot machines.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
and the thing is, like, it came out sometime in the middle of last year. So it's like a hot new game, apparently. I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about slot machines. I'll just throw that out there. I played $5 worth, and
Okay.
that lasted me about 2.5 minutes. But,
Oh, wow. Okay.
Wow.
I did look up a little bit about it.
Okay.
It's made by Konami,
Okay, cool.
because apparently Konami makes slot machines.
I think it's where all their money is, actually. I don't think video games are it, really.
Yeah, no, and they might be an insurance company too, I think.
Oh, like
Is that
Sony.
them?
Sony sells insurance.
Okay, yeah. I
know
feel like
about
all of the Japanese,
Japanese
video
companies,
game
they sell insurance, yeah.
Right. But I guess like pachinko machines and stuff too, probably, right?
Right, yeah. Gambling machines, right?
Right. So I found a press release from when they actually first launched this machine, and it has some of the best quotes. So the players we see this day and age are out looking for entertainment, and there's a lot of entertainment value in the new Dungeons & Dragons slot machines, said Valley View Vice President, blah, 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 blah. They really enjoy the experience. Just watching them, they get excited about additive bonuses within the free spin feature, which takes them to the progressive functionality. It's very fun and interactive.
It's just a slot machine, right?
Yeah, I didn't experience any of that. I don't know what most of those words mean.
Right.
Like, it's a slot machine. You press the button to make the things spin, and then you lose money. So, I don't know. I didn't get the appeal, but apparently this guy did, who says, I like it, and I think other people will like it too, said Giulio Matteo, who devoted several hours to the machine, occasionally passing kisses to the screen for good luck. When asked if he'll be back to play the game, Matteo said, yes, for sure. Maybe I'll try the other one with the Sun Elf, but I want to play the Dragon Warrior game a little more.
Wow, that's
So,
great.
That was my D&D experience.
Very
Okay,
good.
well,
It's good. It's good you get to go back to the classics, right?
Right, yeah, exactly.
A little bit of Dungeons and Dragons.
It's a little different than I remembered it, but, you know, I more or less spent a lot of money for very little entertainment.
So, like, if you hit like triple cherries or sevens or whatever, does it say like crit?
Oh, I don't know. That'd be good. But
Yeah.
I feel like, I don't know. Is there enough of like the demographic overlap between Dungeons and Dragons players and like hardcore slot machine people
I don't know. I'm not
to make
sure.
that work?
You know, I have a theory about this. I think, you know, if you think about like Dungeons and Dragons, the 5th edition of the game, and you think about the fact that Wizards is owned by Hasbro, which is this huge company, right?
Right.
Role-playing games are not in like the sort of per se role-playing games, like just, you know, books being sold to nerds, you know, in bookstores. That's not a huge revenue generator, right? Like
That's true,
it's just
yeah.
not, right?
Yeah.
I think that there is probably an attempt to leverage the hell out of that license, right? So with the release of the 5th edition of the game, it's like, how can we leverage this license in every way imaginable? And slot machines just seems like one of those
Right,
things,
yeah.
right?
That was explicit, I think. That
was it really?
Really, that was
Yeah.
part of their plan. They said that.
I mean, it
you
makes sense.
There wasn't going to be that much material like there was last time. They were going to produce a little material kind of slowly, and then they were going to brand the hell out of it.
Right, yeah.
They were going to make their money that way.
Right, and that seems like a smart move, I guess.
Yep.
I mean, if it keeps Dungeons and Dragons alive, I think that's terrific because, I mean, I have to imagine at some point or another, Hasbro's decided to like, or has threatened to like pull the plug on it, right? Like over the
I'm
years,
sure,
right?
yeah.
So, I mean, yeah.
But yeah, so it's real interesting walking into a casino and seeing the Dungeons and Dragons slot machine right next to like the Ellen slot machine, and
That's awesome.
apparently they're really stretching for licenses. Like anything will get licensed for a slot machine because
Okay,
there was
cool.
a Zuma slot machine next door.
I don't know what
It's
that
like,
is. What is that?
It's an old web game.
Okay. Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
Awesome.
For a minute there, I thought you said Zima, and so I was like, wow.
Oh no, that would be
Alcohol and
good.
beverage
Yeah,
slot.
that
Well,
would
they
be
stopped,
good.
they stopped making the drinks, so
Yeah,
the
right,
Zima's gone. Yeah, yeah. right, cool. Well, my list was, so we've had a 2-week break since we recorded. So my list is a little longer than it is normally. I played in a game of Dungeon World. David, who helped host on episode 8, ran it. It was very good. This was kind of fun to get back into Dungeon World, especially after we had our little, we had that little Dungeon World Love Letter, Love Fest thing on the bonus episode.
Right.
So it was kind of cool to play Dungeon World again. And then we had 2 sessions of what we call our mandatory fun club. We've mentioned that before on the cast. 1 week was just a video game thing. We just decided to play. It was called the Meaningless Video Game Competition. We kind of all just sat around playing video games, and there was this Byzantine set of rules that determined like who was the winner overall, right? And so we did that. But it was still basically arbitrary. But the other one, the other mandatory fun club we did was a game design challenge. And what we did was we watched the movie Bad Education, which is by Pedro Almodovar. For anybody who's, I don't know how the Venn diagram is with,
right.
with like Spanish art house film and role playing game players, but assuming there's a little bit of overlap.
Tie me up, tie me down.
Oh, that's a great one. It's very good. Yeah, very good, Doyle. So we watched Bad Education by Pedro Almodovar with the intent of making a role playing game out of it, or a role playing game inspired by it. Right, that was the challenge.
Right.
And so the rules for the movie watching were: we watched the movie. We each got to pause the movie once. There was like 4 or 5 of us. We each got to pause the movie once, ask questions, discuss it, do whatever we wanted to do, and then continue. And then when it was over, we had a procedure to follow, like a very like detailed procedure to follow to like produce a game at the end, right? It was originally going to be a Powered by the Apocalypse game, but we decided to, after having an initial discussion after the movie was over, we decided that PBTA was not really going to serve our purposes. And so instead we made just kind of like a little quick, on the fly, like unique game. And the movie is about like duplicitous people, people who have like hidden identities, right?
Okay.
And there's hidden identities and like stories within stories and that sort of thing. And so the game we made kind of revolved around this idea of there's like a fulcrum character who has something that each of the players wants, like an NPC. He has something each of the players wants. And each of the players will frame up scenes whereby they will, they'll frame up scenes with the fulcrum character or with each other. And at the end of the scene, we have to learn a truth, like an absolute truth about the character. But then we also have to pose a question about the character. And the question is something that implicates the person's possible duplicity, right?
Okay.
And so as you play the game, you do that for a bit, and then you have a series of scenes where you reincorporate the truths and the questions. So I use my established truth to answer a question about your character, right? So
okay.
You reincorporate those into the scene. And that was kind of it. That was kind of how, as far as
So kind of like a Swords Without Master type
yeah, it was
thing
kind of a
end?
blend of Swords Without Master and Siren.
Okay.
Because Siren has those questions,
Right, yeah.
But it did do the Swords Without Master thing where you reincorporate these established elements into the
Right.
scenes. We didn't get a chance to play test it or anything because the whole night was just spent, watching the movie and coming up with it. But
I'm sure it's great.
I'd like to hammer it out and see how it goes at some point. I don't know when that'll be. So we did that. That was pretty fun. And then I played for the past 2 Sundays, we've been playing Fiasco. Now, normally Dan plans our Sunday games, and because he was out, it was on me to plan the Sunday games. And
And you really brought it, too.
I did too. Yeah, I'm super lazy. So I was like, what games can I run that don't require me to prep anything at all? It turns out Fiasco is a really good choice. So we played 2 sessions of Fiasco over the course of 2 Sundays. The first one, we played the Los Angeles 1936 playset. It was a lot of fun. We kept a very nice, like, mystery noir, gritty tone. It was really cool. Also, we told a very sort of localized story, which is something Fiasco is very good at. Like, Fiasco is very good at telling a story about like just a small clutch of people in a sort of like very localized environment,
Right.
And that's something it does, pretty well. And then, the week after that, we played another playset called The Beast of Sucker Creek. That one was a little more, comedic and gonzo. It's basically just, Swamp Hicks, Swamp Hicks having feuds and rivalries, and the Beast of Sucker Creek, this legendary monster, is kind of implicated. It was really neat. We actually played over the course of the 2 weeks. We played with a number of people who had never played Fiasco, so that was interesting. And in the case of the LA 1936 game, the other players at the table had never played a story game at all, for that matter.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, but it was good. Everyone did really great, and I think it went about as well as it could have gone. By the end, everybody was really getting into it in terms of, well, not by the end, but people were really getting into it in terms of like, speaking in an accent, or like,
right.
That kind of thing. And so it was cool.
Yeah, I have a question about that.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
All right, yeah. So, did you get to see an eye-peeling moment? And by that, I mean...
Define eye-peeling.
I was going to say, this is a term I heard first in the Comics Journal in the letters column. And somebody said that an artist had seen another artist and gotten his eyes peeled.
Okay.
And literally, he saw this other superior, generally considered to be superior artist. And his whole style changed. And his style changed so much in imitation of the artist who peeled his eyes that he unconsciously plagiarized, several frames into his own comics. Okay. So I've always remembered that because it seemed so particular. And there are certain people, when you expose them to a different style of role-playing or a different sort of system or whatever it is, and it really opens up their eyes to the fact that the boundaries that they had imposed because of their own experiences get totally blown. And they go, oh my God, you can't do this? Did you get any of that?
I don't know if that happened. Well, maybe it did. I don't know. The evidence, so the very following Saturday, that same group of people was playing Pathfinder together. So, but they had pre-planned, that was planned before our Fiasco game, so I don't want to say that maybe like it was a total disaster. They decided just to go play Pathfinder instead.
So they put the scales back on their eyes and played Pathfinder.
I don't know if that happened, Doyle. It's an interesting, I've never heard that term, but they definitely did a good job though. Like that was that, there was a little bit of like initial, whenever you have trad gamers who are doing story games for the first time, there's always that like, there's that tendency to want to protect your character.
Sure.
That's a thing,
sure,
right? Sure. There's a tendency to want to protect your character, and there's a tendency to kind of like ask, can I do that? There's a can I do that moment. But once we kind of got past all that stuff and, it was fine. The really nice thing that Fiasco does is it has, I don't know if you've ever played it, but
yes,
it has this really excellent like setup process whereby you set up and establish relationships and establish elements in the story. And I think that for people who have experience with role-playing games already, but maybe not story games, that setup process for Fiasco does kind of like get people into the right headspace, I think. So it's pretty helpful in that regard. We did Fiasco. And then the only other thing that I've played this week, was we started a new game of Apocalypse World. I'm looking at my list right now, and it kind of reads like a who's who of story games, right? There's like Dungeon World, Fiasco, Apocalypse World, like all the big ones. That was just happenstance. We started Apocalypse World. It was just character setup and world creation type stuff. So we didn't really get to do, we played out a couple of good scenes, but, there's not much to say yet. I suspect next week we'll have something to say about it. But, those were my games.
Great.
So I guess we will move on to Giving Me Life. So our next segment is called Giving Me Life. I think I'm going to start this time. So there is a podcast, a very well-regarded podcast called Hardcore History. You guys might be familiar with it.
Yeah, love Hardcore History.
It's by Dan Carlin. It's probably one of the top-rated podcasts that, in terms of like just number of listeners and stuff, it's a big deal. He is in the middle of well, let me set it up first. Hardcore History is this guy, Dan Carlin, and he essentially releases these episodes that are about 3 or 4 hours of just him talking about a subject in history. Okay.
Right.
And, it's so good. He's a masterful, like, oral storyteller, right? Yeah. He's really, really good.
Well, he was a radio guy for a long time.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't know anything about him. He's on Slate podcast every now and then. That's all I know. But he's very, very good at like telling, just weaving a really good story. And I love storytellers, right? And he's a good one. He takes these, he finds sometimes very obscure things in history and kind of does an episode on those, or he'll find like, or he'll do topics that we've all know about, like on a sort of surface level.
Right.
Like for example, he did a whole series on Genghis Khan,
right.
Which was incredible. Like it was just, I think in total it was probably like almost 30 hours of material about Genghis Khan, right? And it was so good and deep and like just this really, really fascinating exploration of the subject. And so, his most recent series that he's done is called Blueprint for Armageddon. It is about World War I. And, it's really kind of about like the first couple of years of World War I in a way. Does he? I don't know if I haven't finished listening to it yet, but he spends a lot of time on the run up to the war and the sort of planning that was involved in the war.
Right.
And just sort of the geopolitical situations going on, and kind of, he spends everything up to this point. I'm about 3 episodes in. There's 5 episodes total. Has all been just about like before America entered the war. Right.
Right.
And, it's great. It is so, so good. I'm on episode 3 of 5. Episode 3 of 5, that constitutes, I've listened to about 12 or 13 hours of World War I stuff. Really, really good. His angle, which I love, well, it's not really his angle, but it's a theme that he, returns to a lot, is World War I was the first modern war, right? Like, as opposed to, say, the Napoleonic Wars, right?
Right.
And the way he tells the story, he emphasizes like that this was like such a new way of like doing war, right? And
right.
like, and sort of like all the implications of that, right?
And
like,
no one knew what they were doing.
Nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody knew what to expect. You suddenly have all these like crazy killing machines that they didn't have before. One of the things that he points out that I just love, like it's just a visual that I love, is that the French like showed up like in horsehair helmets and like, breastplates and like, blue pants, like, as if it were like, the Napoleonic era, right? Whereas like the Germans showed up in like heavy helmets and they had artillery and they were, like it was just a lopsided thing in the beginning of the war. That's sort of like the paint he's working with, this idea of, it was truly like how we were thrust into the modern age, right?
Right.
And it was a brutal, nasty thrust, right? I just love it. It's so good. If you have, for my job, I drive a lot, so it's like a really, really good thing just to kind of put on and kind of like just soak it all in. Blueprint for Armageddon, hardcore history, really, really good stuff.
Great.
Doyle, what's giving you life?
Well, mine isn't quite as serious as that. I've been doing a lot of prep to try to take, I think they're called the GREs. They're a series of tests to get into grad school.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing a lot of reading, specifically in general sort of canon of English literature, the great books. And that is getting kind of exploded in the last 20 years or so, which you may or may not care about. But I've been doing a lot of different reading, and I'm really putting off some of the more modern classics like Philip Roth and people like that, because they seem really, really boring to me, even though I know that they're beautifully written, and I can't stand that sort of stuff. But anyway, the other thing I've been doing is working on I put together a senior thesis for my last year of, regular 4-year college, and I'm rewriting that as an article under the guidance of one of my mentors. And I've rewritten that about 4 or 5 times, and I'm ready to rip it apart and never talk about it again.
Is it giving you life?
Right, yeah.
It's more like sucking out the life.
It sounds like it's draining your life.
My session is sucking out the life rather than giving it. Now,
it's giving life to something else.
For the things that are really giving me life, I have this, usual thing where I'll go back to my bookshelves and I'll pull out something I haven't looked at in a while, and I'll fall in love with it back again. And in this case, it's something called, the overarching name of it was Space 1889. It was a role-playing game put out by Games Designer Workshop, the same guys who did Traveller. And it was basically the first steampunk game.
Okay.
And it wasn't called steampunk. That was even before that term was, generally in use.
Okay.
And it's just that the tagline is science fiction role-playing in a more civilized time.
Oh.
And I've read a lot of Victorian literature.
Right,
I know it wasn't really very civilized. But
it had the veneer of civility, right? Yeah,
right. And so I've been reading that, and there's a board game for it called Sky Galleons of Mars, where you have all these flying warships from colonial powers on Mars who are attempting to, colonize Mars the same way they colonized Africa and other parts of the world in the real world. And it's a wonderful game. It's an elegant game. It's about to be, I think, kickstarted again in the next year or so.
Like you do.
And
right.
Like you do. Yeah. Like you do. And I'm just falling in love with it again, and I'm getting out all my old models that I never put together originally, and I'm going to kind of fiddle with them and get them set up and get ready to play with them and play with my wife. My wife is a gamer too. I'm very thankful for that.
Very lucky in that.
Yes, because my significant other actually games with me, and I know that this is kind of a rare thing.
It is, yeah,
and a very precious thing. So so I'm getting ready to put that together so that we can play that, and then. My wife plays lots of video games. She plays lots of Minecraft, especially, and I've been enjoying playing with her as I always do. So that's about it for me.
Yeah, the whole boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse who plays games with you that's a rare treasure.
It is, yeah.
It is
I feel very, very blessed.
I can get my boyfriend to occasionally play board games with me, and he'll very rarely play a role-playing game, but only if he gets to be really over the top and gonzo about it, right? He does not want to play anything that even has a whiff of seriousness, and he definitely doesn't want to play anything with dragons and shit. So,
well, I hear that.
Yeah, we know. But yeah, so that's what's pretty cool. Dan, what's giving you life?
So the thing that's giving me life is digging giant holes. So.
Okay, very good.
I was on vacation, and we went to Las Vegas for 4 days, which, giant casinos, just engineered to maximally entertain the most amount of people with the smallest amount of space. Then we went to Utah for a while and were surrounded by the splendor of nature. And through all of that, though, the one thing that gave me the most concentrated joy was there's a place a little bit off the strip in Las Vegas where, for a frankly ridiculous amount of money, you can go and they'll let you drive an excavator around an empty lot.
Nice.
And just dig giant holes and spin around in circles and do things pick up giant tires and move them from one side of the empty lot to the other side of the empty lot and stack them up. And it sounds ridiculous, but I swear to God, I have never had more fun in my life.
Wow.
Than I had just digging holes in the middle of a vacant lot in Vegas.
So 4-year-old little boys have it figured out, right?
They really do. Yeah. But I mean, they're chumps, right? They just have the tiny piece of crap toys. But so this thing is amazing.
That is the genius of American capitalism right there.
It really is.
Somebody figured out a way to do that and make money off it.
Right, yeah. Someone's making money hand over fist in Vegas with an empty lot full of dirt and 3 excavators. So
that's nice.
It's amazing.
I love it.
It's called Dig This, if anybody's in Vegas. Right. Everything about it is amazing.
Wow.
So
that's good.
Go dig some holes in the desert.
Nice.
It is a blast.
Nice. All right. Well, I guess we will go ahead and move on to our topic. So for our topic today, we're going to talk about the OSR. If it wasn't already obvious from our list of games we played recently, Doyle is something of he's been involved in the OSR community for a long time. Why don't we start, Doyle, by having you define for us what does the acronym mean, first of all? I think I get it wrong every time I bring it up to somebody. And so yeah, let's do definitions.
Okay, well that's pretty expected, because if you talk to any particular person in the OSR, they'll give you a different definition of what the OSR is. It's
the OSR. So you say the OSR as if it were a community.
It's like the Ohio State University.
It's a movement. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think of it as a movement. I think of it as a group of people who have closely aligned but not necessarily completely matching goals. The first mention of it, I mean, it's the usual definition of it is old school Renaissance.
Okay.
Now, I've also heard it old school revival.
I've heard that too.
I've also heard it old school rules. I've heard it a number of different ways. And I mean, the term old school has been around, I think in general parlance anyway, since the 80s.
Oh, probably older, I imagine.
Or even older.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So there are, bloggers who use it. There are people who produce material who use it. There are people who do all sorts of convention scenarios only that do it. So they generally have a sort of belief that the more modern versions of Dungeons and Dragons and other games are not the way that they want to play their fantasy game.
Okay.
And when we talk about Dungeons and Dragons, we're talking, because there have been so many rule sets for it, we're talking more almost about an idea of what people think Dungeons and Dragons should be, rather than any particular sort of rule set or particular rules approach.
We've actually addressed that in the cast before. I think on the bonus episode, in fact, like this notion of like, there's an idea of what Dungeons and Dragons is.
Right.
Like in our sort of,
Right.
like rose-colored memory or
Sure,
whatever.
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so everybody has that. I mean, I have a fair amount of rose-colored memory about my own experiences, and some of which weren't that great, you know, when I actually look back and reflect and try to compare them. I'm having a lot more fun playing Dungeons and Dragons now than I ever did when I started playing.
Okay.
So, I mean, that being the case, the reason that these definitions are so important is that they have a tendency to emphasize the fact that there are so many different people, and they seem to come from different directions, and you would think that they wouldn't be a movement at all. But they seem to kind of coalesce into this thing that you can look at. It's like pornography, right?
Okay.
So you can look at it and go, oh, that's OSR.
Right, yeah.
And
you know it when you see it.
You know it
like
when you see
like
it.
a famous Supreme Court justice
That's right.
said once.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the first people who I think talked about their dissatisfaction with the current state of the world's most popular role-playing game.
Right.
As the euphemism goes.
Yeah, it's often referred to. I've seen that, yeah.
So there was a game that came out pretty closely after 3.0 called Hackmaster. It got its birth in the Knights of the Dinner Table comic strip.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So they played a game called Hackmaster, which was this sort of jokey sort of game where they had lots of things in it even that weren't in D&D. And they decided that they wanted to try to write this game and publish it. The creators, Jolly Blackburn, I think is the guy's name. And they went ahead and they tried to put something on paper, and then they figured out, hey, wait a second, this is basically first edition. So how are we going to do that?
Right, yeah.
So they went to WotC and they said, look, can we license
WotC being Wizards of the Coast.
Wizards of the Coast,
Yeah.
who are the controllers and owners of Dungeons and Dragons.
They bought TSR back in the late 90s.
They bought TSR
right?
back in the late 90s. Yes, late 90s. And they were about to come out with 3.0 at that time. So this would have been around 2000. And so they said, can we license first edition and the first edition modules? And for whatever reason, I don't know any of the details, they said yes. And so for years, Hackmaster was this monstrous homebrewed variant of first edition with these really sort of jokey, in-joke sort of modules that were adaptations of first edition modules. So lots of people played that and liked it. But it was still not exactly what people remembered.
Right.
And so there are some people who decided that they wanted to produce their own game using the open game license, which was the introduction with Dungeons & Dragons 3.0.
Right, yeah.
And these were the Troll Lord guys who did Castles and Crusades. And they wanted a game that used modern mechanics, but that harkened back to a different style of play.
Okay.
Because by then we had kind of figured out that even though this Dungeons & Dragons really kind of looked back for the genesis of its ideas, it also was this entirely new sort of thing, in that it had a bunch of rules for doing all sorts of things, which were just kind of assumed or in the background.
Okay.
Like skills were always kind of assumed to be there. There's even an option for background schools and schools in the first edition.
Right.
And all these sort of things were brought to the fore and given form, rather than being just somebody's house rules.
Sure, or hand-waved or whatever.
Or hand-waved or whatever.
Yeah.
All right, but a lot of people were beginning to realize that they didn't quite like this. Now, I wasn't one of those people. At the time, I was like, wow, I'm playing Dungeons & Dragons again and liking it.
Right, yeah.
And a lot of my friends were saying the same thing.
Yeah.
They were like, literally, one guy said to me, I'm proud to be able to say I'm playing Dungeons & Dragons again for the first time in years.
Right, yeah.
And so that continued until we actually had campaigns in the game.
Okay.
And I ran a campaign in 3.0 for about 3 or 4 years. Pretty much within a year or so of it coming out. And then I ran a campaign in 3.5 for about an equal amount of time. And by the time that was over in, say, like 2008 or so, I despised the game.
Okay.
I hated 3.5 with a grand passion.
Is it because it felt like indentured servitude?
It felt like some sort of slavery, but I can't precisely express how bad it was because it was so bad.
Yeah.
I was up to the point, we were playing in a high-level game, and I was prepping 3 to 4 hours per week for a single game session.
Okay.
And there were so many rules and so many exceptions.
The exceptions are what get you, right?
And so many feats.
Yeah.
And I would have to literally retype out stat blocks and then add the descriptions of the different feats and special abilities until the stat blocks were pages and pages, and they were already like a page long or 2 pages long for the really awesome stuff.
Yeah.
And they got to be expanded to like 5 or 6 pages just so I could run the thing correctly and present a challenge to my players, who were all min-max monsters
Oh, sure.
out
Yeah.
the wazoo.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I wasn't able to challenge them. I wasn't able to provide a sense. It was almost like they came to the table, they beat the bad guys, they got more treasure, they leveled up,
Right.
rinse and repeat.
Right. Yeah. I think, I'm going to just to interject. That was the biggest, I missed that whole bit of role-playing games. I wasn't playing role-playing games during the early 2000s. And, but I came back to it. I came back to role-playing games via Pathfinder, right? Pathfinder was what brought me back kind of like when they were playtesting that, right? Like in 07 or whatever it was. And, I did it for a little bit. I did Pathfinder for a little bit, and I thought to myself, it just felt like work. It felt like just a horrible job, like running it just felt like this terrible, terrible job. And I just like this, I was like, I almost like didn't do role-playing games. I was like, I don't think this is for me, like it sounds like maybe you had a similar experience eventually,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Like where it just became like this incredibly burdensome amount of effort.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. And so while this was happening, other people who were smarter than I was were figuring this out faster than I was. They didn't have to subject themselves to all this pain.
Yeah.
All right. So there were people who take a look at Castles and Crusades were hoping that it would be very much like the older games. And in fact, it has somewhat more modern mechanics. It has sort of an old school feel. And there are people who are producing sort of old school modules, like Goodman Games, but for the current rule set.
Right.
And that just wasn't satisfying enough for some people. And one of those guys was a guy named Matt Fitch, who you should really, really have on this podcast.
He's local, right?
Because he's local.
Yeah.
Right.
He's in the Gauntlet. I know that. Like he's in a membership. Yeah.
Right. So he worked on a set of rules using the Wizards of the Coast open game license, and it was called OSRIC.
Mm-hmm.
And that stands for Old School Rules Index and Compilation.
It's good.
Okay.
It's a good name.
It's catchy.
It's catchy.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's real catchy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like it.
All right. So that was essentially first edition recapitulated.
Okay.
And then after that, he moved on. I don't know exactly why he moved on. You'll have to ask him yourself. But he produced something called White Box Swords and Wizardry, which was what we're talking now about is retro clones, by the way. And they're called retro clones because they're clones of the original systems.
Right.
They're retroactive cloning using the open game license.
Right.
Okay. So he moved on to produce something that was a clone of the original white box set of Dungeons and Dragons, just the 3 books.
Okay.
And the reason that you would do that at all is that there are people who have been going back and rereading the original 3 books to see what it is or what it was that they had missed.
Okay.
As a sort of almost an academic exercise.
I can see that. Yeah.
In parsing the game, like a close reading you have in English.
Almost anthropological.
Right.
Yeah.
So you go over the text with a fine comb and you find out what's there and you try to figure out what's changed and why did it change.
Okay.
And I we've talked a little bit about this before, but there's a general assumption that the rules of the rule book do influence the behavior at the table. And
right.
I don't know if you guys have talked about this in previous podcasts, but I think I've talked about it at like Gauntlet meetings.
Yeah, I'm sure we have. Yeah. If the idea, you're the idea of like the rules should enforce a certain style of play.
Right.
Right.
All right. And I think that's true even for something like Dungeons and Dragons. And so when the rules radically change from something like the original version, the white box set is what it's called, to something so radically different like 3.0, 3.5,
right,
there's a radical shift in the play style.
Right, yeah.
That you don't necessarily assume. You always sort of assume that later is better, and that the play style today is somehow superior or better than the play style that was in the past.
Well, I think that's what I discovered when I came back to Pathfinder, and Pathfinder is just another version of 3.5, right?
Right,
just so
right.
people understand that.
Right.
What I discovered was, because I grew up on Second Ed, right? That
Right.
was the version I played
Right.
of D&D. And I remember not I did not have minis, not really. I mean, they were available, but I didn't really use them. You know, I might occasionally scratch out a map on a graph paper or whatever, but there was no like concern about distance and measuring squares
and positioning
and all this sort of simulationist sort of stuff, right? And that was the very shocking thing to me about Pathfinder. Like, it was the hot thing, and that's what I came back to, you know, when I was coming back to RPGs. But it was, I remember, I hate this phrase so much, but but it works. I was doing theater of the mind, right? Like theater of the mind, which is the worst phrase ever in this hobby. If there's a terrible phrase, I don't know, more terrible, I don't know what it is. But that's what I was doing, right? And it was a bit of a like, it was just, I don't know, just a bit of a system shock for me to see like what D&D had become, you know? Yeah.
And so, you know, I had that sort of, shock too, but I didn't have that shock until I started reading people like Matt Finch.
Right.
Okay, so he came out with something called the Old School Primer, which was just this sort of précis, I believe is the term. I can't really know it. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but a little summary of what was different.
I've read that word. I've never said it though, so
yeah,
I don't know.
Well, all right. So, it was just like a little essay where he talked about what was different.
Right. Yeah.
And the things that he talked about were different. Let me look at my notes here so I can make sure I get it right. Is the first thing he talked about, rulings, not rules.
Okay.
Let me say that in a deep stentorian tones for you. Rulings, not rules. And that was something that it took me a while to get over because I've been always a very by the book sort of guy.
Right.
And I realized that my favorite games that I played and the best experiences I had were not when I was a by the book sort of guy.
Right.
I had been running Call of Cthulhu at tournament conventions for years. And in the tournament convention, you have a lot of license. You're generating the characters beforehand. You're doing all sorts of special circumstances and stuff that doesn't happen in normal campaigns.
Right.
It should, probably. And so, you know, you run roughshod over the rules. You really do.
Right,
You bend them to get them to do what you want.
To get the outcome that you want. Right.
And I realized that is exactly what I needed to do in my regular campaigns.
Okay, yeah.
So a way of looking at this is to understand that rules for games like, let's say, chess.
Right.
Or Parcheesi, or what's a Euro game?
Oh, Settlers or something.
Settlers of Catan.
Yeah.
If you break a rule, you break the game.
Right.
The game no longer has any meaning.
Right, yeah.
Role-playing game rules are not really rules, I think.
Yeah. We'll disagree about this.
Okay.
But continue. Yeah.
All right. They're procedures.
Right.
So a procedure is different than a rule. A procedure is this is how you get this done. This is how you get to this point. This is how you make this happen. And the procedures need to change based on circumstance. And so role-playing rules, in my opinion, really aren't rules in the same way that other game rules are. They're really procedures.
Okay.
And you are expected, I think, in a successful game where you have a successful time at the table that you play at.
Yeah.
To be able to break the rules whenever you need to.
Okay. Let me say my bit. So it would be something akin to story gamer malpractice, not to interject here.
Yes, please.
So here's the thing. I think what I think is really interesting is that I feel like the OSR and the story game community get to the same place, but like from a radically different perspective or philosophy, right? I think from a story gamer vantage point, the idea is the rules, that stuff should be codified. Like the rules should deliver an outcome like on their own, right? Like you should be able to follow the rules closely and get a certain outcome. Sure. Whereas what you're saying is you should be able to bend the rules and warp them as needed to get to that outcome.
Yes.
And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I just think it's an interesting difference. I'm sure not every story gamer feels this way, but I think there's like a desire in the story game, like design community to like create a slim, manageable set of rules that if you follow them, they give you that outcome every time.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't hear about a lot of like homebrews.
There's no
being
homebrews.
applied
Yeah.
to story games. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, like the games get hacked for different settings and stuff sometimes, like Apocalypse World.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. But that's to tell a different story. That's
Right,
not to like make it work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But like if you put My Life with Master down on the table and play it according to its rules, you're going to get a certain outcome every time, right? Like it's that, like, and the only thing that can really screw it up is if your players just aren't playing in the spirit of the game, right? And that's going to be true of any role-playing game, I think. So it's just an interesting distinction, and I think it's worth kind of highlighting.
And it's interesting because a designer that you mention quite often, who created the Burning Wheel role-playing game, what's his name?
We don't mention him too often, but he is a character that we love here at the Gauntlet.
Yes. So, but that was his distinction that he made at a Gen Con seminar that I went to. is that
this is Luke Crane. Just
this
so
is
people
Luke
know.
Crane.
Yeah.
And that was his contention. He was there with Jared Sorensen, and they were doing the Luke and Jared show, basically.
Okay, yeah.
Where they promulgate this exact idea.
Right, yeah. And it's an idea that it's stuck, right, in this in a certain branch of the hobby, right? Yeah.
All right. So, well, let me go ahead. That was interesting, and I want to come back to that later as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
But, so after Swords and Wizardry, you had something called Labyrinth Lord, which was Basic and Expert, essentially.
Sure.
Old Basic and Expert box games. Right.
D&D, right.
Right. And then after that, the kind of floodgates just sort of started opening, and people started coming out with clones of Second Edition and the Rules
which is the
Cyclopedia.
Second Edition clone?
I think,
I'd be interested in
Adventures
playing
Dark
that.
and Deep. No, that's a First Edition clone. I know there's one out there.
Yeah.
I was
I'll
kickstarted.
look it up. I'll Google it.
So, but there is one out there. So, and there were others along these lines. And then we started seeing something new, which was people doing essentially what are remixes of older rule sets. So Lamentation of the Flame Princess is the one that comes to mind.
Right. Very
To
controversial game, right?
Well, for some people, yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of naughty bits in pictures.
Oh, I have it. It does.
And so, and there's some, and the gentleman involved uses Dungeons and Dragons, and there's this sort of thing about D&D. So that any instant, if you're playing a very sort of loose campaign, at any instant it can turn from a tale of heroic fiction into a horror story very quickly. You can go into something like the Tomb of Horrors, and you can die in various horrible ways that looks like something like a horror movie, except, everybody's wearing chainmail and wielding swords or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
So he really liked that part of the game. And so what he wanted was a sort of Weird Tales-esque, Lovecraftian sort of version of Dungeons and Dragons, where the people who went into these awful places called dungeons were really almost crazy already.
Right, yeah.
Because nobody in their sane mind would really go into these incredibly hostile environments and challenge them in order to get a bunch of money. Like that's the very definition of insane.
Right, yeah.
All right. So, these are people who are driven, who are effectively insane, and they're going into these really, really awful places. One of the most famous modules of the OSR was written by him. And his name, by the way, is James. And let me make sure I get his name
Raggy, right?
Or it's Raji.
Oh, Raji.
It's Raji, not Raji. So he wrote something called Deathfrost Doom.
Okay.
And I almost am resistant to telling you about it because I want to have the pleasure of running you guys through it at some point.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. But it is one of these things that, like the best horror movies, bites you in the butt.
Okay.
And by that, I mean that there is, you get to a point where you realize, oh my God, what have I done?
Okay.
You have the naked lunch moment, right? Because William S. Burroughs used to say, it's that moment where you realize what's on the end of your fork.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? That's the naked lunch moment. All right. So, that's what he looks for. He wants players to have that feeling.
Sure.
Wrapped up in the horror motifs and blood and gore and whatever else. And the weird, stuff that happens in his modules.
Right.
All right. So that's one example. And then on the other end, there's something called DCC RPG, the Dungeon Crawl Classics.
I love,
role-playing
by the way.
game.
I love
you
DCC.
do that?
I do. Yeah.
All
I've actually never played it, but I own like almost every DCC
Thing
thing there is.
module.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know. I own like everything for it.
So, and it's got this very 70s sort of aesthetic.
Yeah.
And its whole idea is that I wanted to go back to the original Appendix N, as it's called.
All right. Yeah.
Stories. And it does that fairly well. But what it does that nobody talks about, I think, a lot, is that it has all these tables, and people call it very swingy because of that. But what it's doing, it's using those tables as props for you to get players to act like they should act in an old school experience. In an old school experience, you are not supposed to be taking your fighter, okay, and slamming on the monster every round to do 1 to 8 points of damage, plus whatever magical bonus or damage bonus you have.
Right, yeah.
You're supposed to be a freaking Conan. You're supposed to be a warrior swinging from ropes.
Right, yeah.
Throwing your sword at the evil sorcerer. You're supposed to be stunning all the time.
Right, yeah.
And so they have rules in DCC to encourage that. And even, times that I've played DCC, half the time the guy who's playing the warrior freaking doesn't remember to do a stunt.
Right, yeah.
And because it's so hard to get people to kind of exist and step outside of that box that they're used to.
Right.
Where they go, oh, I can do anything.
Right, yeah. Let me, so I want to cut in here real quick because I actually have read the DCC rules. That book, the DCC rule book, is probably my favorite role-playing game book, just as in terms of like an object or an artifact of role-playing games.
Sure.
Just beautiful. Love that book. The stunt thing that fighters do, so they can like, as I recall, they can, I can't remember how it's a narrative thing though, like where you basically get like full narrative control over what the stunt does, right?
Pretty much.
And there's some mechanical like thing that allows you to trigger it, right?
Right.
And when you said just now, like, people forgetting to do the stunt, one of the things that I like about Dungeon World, Dungeon World is definitely more in the story game mold, but it has that, like, I think it has the spirit of OSR in it, right?
Sure.
And one of the things that I like about Dungeon World that I think Dungeon World kind of fixes that problem is you don't trigger the moves in Dungeon World until you have said what your character is doing, right? Like, like the move follows your narration, right? So to do anything, you must narrate, right? And I kind of like that. But I do remember liking that stunt thing in DCC. I remember thinking, that's pretty cool. Like it's a nice like nod to the idea of like giving the players like some directorial control over what their character is actually doing on screen, right? Pretty cool.
And that's what I like about the Apocalypse World games, as a matter of fact, is that they have that kind of stunning system almost baked into that role.
It's the whole game. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so that you can never forget because it's all about what you're doing.
Right.
And that's a really, really cool thing about Apocalypse World or Dungeon World. That was one of the games that I recently bought that was a story game that I didn't, want to sell when I was culling through my games recently.
Yeah.
Because that was the sort of thing I thought, wow, I could play this and really like this.
Yeah.
And so now I'm probably going to get hate mail from some OSR guys, maybe. I don't know. None of you guys send me hate mail.
Hopefully
about
not.
that. But, I think there's actually
a lot.
I actually think there's a lot of crossover specifically with the Dungeon World and a lot of the world games. So.
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you said that just now about like getting hate mail. I seriously dislike this sort of like, oh, I play this type of game and this is my little tribe, right? And
right.
I mean, when I think OSR people and story gamers can all agree that trad players suck. So let's be united on that front, shall we? That's what we should do.
Well, when you say trad gamers, you mean people who play Pathfinder?
I mean 3.0 and higher.
3.0 and higher.
Shadowrun, you name it, right?
All right.
Yeah. When I say trad, I mean a very specific thing. I mean like, and I don't. I'm joking, listeners. You guys are fine. There's nothing wrong with trad players. But when I say it, I mean a very specific kind of like. These are the people who are like buying the latest role-playing game, big giant glossy books on shelves, right? Those games. That's what I mean. But
all right, I got you.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I mean, I played all those games, and at first, they're very attractive, but after a while, and I told you that I was going to be randy at points, right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
like, here's my other rant.
Go
so,
for it.
if you have this big book of rules, and you have a guy who spends an hour or so min-maxing his character because he has, literally hundreds of options, some of which are probably never really designed to work with each other.
Yeah.
You're going to get some weird outcomes. Okay. But, some people, that is the way that they express themselves in role-playing. I don't think it's particularly among the best ways to express yourself in role-playing games.
Right.
But I have to admit, there's plenty of people who do it. When I moved to OSR...
There's a certain pleasure in it, too.
Yeah, there's a pleasure.
I think there's like a tendency to do that because you have such limited options for how you interact with the game. Then there's a tendency to want to like maximize your contribution when you get your 10 seconds to do your thing.
Yes.
Before you have to wait 30 minutes for it to come back around to you.
So,
right. Yeah, for sure.
And that's one of the nice things about being in an OSR game. It's very quick.
Right.
You take your turn, it gets done with fairly quickly, and then you move on to somebody else. And I mean, that's a thing that just drove me up the wall, is having a guy who's min-maxed out the wazoo.
Right, yeah.
And he has all these sort of different things. And it's something I indulged in too.
Sure. It has its pleasures, right? Like, there was a whole, like, 4-episode character arc I went through where I was playing the Pathfinder adventure card game, right? And the pleasure of that game was, min-maxing, like making my guy the best they can be.
Sure.
Like, finding all the loot, leveling up. Like, that has a certain pleasure to it. Like, but I think personally there's more pleasure to be found in adversity, though. That's just my personal opinion.
I think so too. But not all of my friends agreed with me. I actually lost people that I had played with for years when I didn't want to play any of these more complex games anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's...
The trad games that you're talking about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that story games taught me, that I think is, there's got to be a little bit of this spirit in the OSR, I'm sure. The idea that like you're winning even if your character is losing, right?
Right.
As long as you're being heroic and as long as it's funny or entertaining or you're having a good time and the story is rollicking along, you're winning, right? Like it doesn't just, even if your character in the fiction is not winning, that is something that, that's a bit of a chasm to cross for some players, right? Like it's a thing that I think a lot of players, like more traditional players don't, they play defensively,
And I was able to learn that lesson very early through Call of Cthulhu.
Oh, well, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, you're not supposed to win in Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
It is a tragedy.
Yeah.
You were asking about Pendragon earlier. Pendragon, ideally, I think, is best when it's a tragedy. Because at the end of the campaign, everything falls apart.
Right. Okay.
Okay. And you die, and it's sad. And I like that.
Well, Mort Arthur is a tragedy, right? Essentially,
exactly,
right?
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. So, but anyway, going back to this strange little outline that I had talked about before, I can't see anything else that I wanted to talk about.
Well, so here's, okay, I'll jump in there. I think this has been really good. I think I'd like to wrap it up with just this last little bit here. So the one thing that's always kind of like perplexed me about the OSR, what I don't understand about it.
Sure.
Why not just go back and play first edition Dungeons and Dragons?
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like,
yes.
Like those things are available.
Yeah.
Like, or at least they are now. Like, what is the, why not?
I have to tell you, up until recently, they weren't available.
Okay.
About 2 or 3 years ago, they started reprinting the first edition, second edition, original edition in hardcover. And just recently, they started releasing some of these things in PDF, right? But there was a long period of time where they only had PDFs of modules, and then they shut down PDFs entirely.
Okay.
They said no more PDFs.
Right.
And it was only until like the last year or two that they started doing it again. And you know what Matt Finch actually wrote on his blog immediately after Wizards of the Coast announced that they were going to do this again?
Right, yeah.
You know what he said?
What?
We won.
Okay.
We won.
Yeah.
The main reason that he specifically started working on his retro clones was to have the stuff available for people so they could actually play the game.
Okay.
In a legal manner.
Yeah, okay.
Without having to either search out a really expensive book or having to pirate a PDF.
Because you could use the OGL, which is the original game license, right?
Right.
You could use that to basically remake D&D.
Exactly.
Essentially, right.
And that's exactly what he did. And it's from those first few games and retro clones like Hackmaster and Castle Crusades and then the actual retro clones that all the rest of this kind of flowed.
Nice.
Which is why I think he's so, incredibly important.
We should get him on the show.
Absolutely.
Matt Finch. Let's get him on the show.
Absolutely.
He's local. We should do it. Cool. Well, is there anything else you guys want to say about the OSR?
No.
I'm guessing it's a no, Dan.
Dan, what a shock, Dan.
Yeah, I've been really chatty.
Dan, why don't you spend 10 minutes telling us how much you hate dungeons and elves and dragons and
well, those things are all terrible.
and pretty much everything that the OSR does.
Basically, yeah.
What about Traveler, Dan? Would you play Traveler?
I would play Traveler.
Okay. Yeah. I would play Traveler just so my character, like you said, so our character can die during character
exactly,
creation.
Yeah, that would be the best.
I'm rolling my eyes now. For those of you outside the room,
that's the thing that people who don't play Traveler know about Traveler. That's the only thing. That's the only thing we know.
I think there's spaceships or something involved,
Right,
but
that's
I
all we
know
know.
you can die during character creation.
Exactly.
Yes. Well,
Cool.
Okay. So, I have to say, it is now my heart's desire to get you in a fantasy game, and I will get you in a fantasy game. There may be no elves and there may be no dragons, but it will be a fantascy game.
Well, if you do that, then I could be in because it's the elves and the dwarves.
I think it's
and shit
specifically
that I can't
the
take
elves he doesn't
seriously.
like.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So fair enough. All right.
Cool. Well, that was very good. Let's move on to the next segment. All right, so it's time for our listener feedback section, or segment rather, of the show. So in episode 8, we talked about what we were calling railroads, or games that are on rails. And if I'm being honest, it was really we began talking about games that have a very, very like tight structure, which I guess you could perceive as a rail, being on rails or on railroads. The word on rails and railroads, it was mostly just kind of like a rhetorical Trojan horse to talk about this real specific style of game that I wanted to talk about, right? But we got some feedback from listener Steve. He is also co-host Steve. You may remember him from several episodes back. We got some really, really good feedback from Steve, and I would like to share some of it. He wrote a really nice post on Google Plus in response. I may kind of skip ahead a little bit in it. It's pretty long, but it's pretty good. He says, role-playing games involve a promise, whether explicit or implicit. Dungeons & Dragons, for instance, promises players that they can be fantasy heroes or scoundrels, stabbing creatures and taking their things while adventuring through a fantasy land. It's a vague but expansive promise. What can you do in this game? All sorts of things. The game itself, like most traditional games, imposes little in the way of structural limitations on the agendas players can pursue. Can they invade a dungeon and kill everything that moves? Totally. Can they say screw that and try to take over the kingdom next door? Totally. Can they set up a mercenary crew, keep dungeony pets, bring magic to the masses? Yeah, probably. Railroading at its worst is an unspoken violation of that promise. And I want to step back for a minute because I like that characterization of railroading, right? It's a violation of the promise because we were saying that that promise, we kind of framed that promise as a bad thing, I think, a little bit in our discussion. Like that promise was kind of like maybe not a thing to pursue. I like his characterization though of like that promise can be a good thing and that railroading is a violation of it. He says, what can you do in this game? All sorts of things that I planned for you to do, right?
Right.
Yeah. And in more traditional games, often the only thing players have any sort of real control over is their characters' actions. Railroading is furthermore a violation of the promise that their characters are just that, theirs. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. A structured game, on the other hand, that's what he kind of made a point that like, you know, what we were talking about truly was games that are just have a lot of structure, right? I would say that the games we were talking about were just a very specific kind of structure, but it's just kind of semantics. But he says, a structured game, on the other hand, incorporates its railroading into its mechanics. In other words, it makes a different promise to players. Kagamatsu doesn't promise that PCs are a ronin and the women of a Japanese village left to do whatever they'd like. It promises that the women will try to convince Kagamatsu to stay and fight off some sort of horrible doom. A Taste for Murder makes the promise that there will be accusations and cajoling and a murder, and the big investigation that will take place. The Mountain Witch is a ronin heading toward a final confrontation with a witch. Grey Ranks is a series of missions on specific days dealing with events of the Polish resistance. All of these things are baked in. You sit down to play one of these games, and in learning the game's mechanics, you learn to an extent what you're in for. The traditional railroading GM, on the other hand, is basically attempting to trick and or force a group of players into doing things they might not agree to if they were forewarned. This is why players despise it. There's a level of consent that's lacking. I like that a lot. I kind of paraphrased a little bit in the middle, but I quite like that characterization of the whole conversation. What are your thoughts?
So I think I agree with that for the most part. The one thing I would say is that I do still think that the idea that traditional role-playing games are about doing anything and, you know, doing whatever you want and the whole world is your playground, I think that's false. Because, I mean, we've kind of talked about it before. I don't know if we were on the mics when we did it, but when you give players a rule book that's full of things about this is how you stab things and this is how you shoot magic at things, that's kind of what that's kind of what they're going to be doing, right? Like, you're not going to go into this world and open up a bakery or something like that. So,
right, yeah.
Like, there's already some railroading happening, right?
Right, yeah.
Like, you don't have the ability to do anything.
Right,
So
yeah.
I think that promise is kind of false.
What do you think
already.
about... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Doyle.
Yeah, you saw me curl my lip as I have to, restrain myself from jumping over the mic and attacking Dad. One of my games, a couple of my games, but the one that I run on a regular basis in the neighborhood, that's with live people at a table rather than over G+, is specifically a sandbox. It's the oldest actual game world. It's called Wilderlands, the Wilderlands of high fantasy. These were incredibly brief little mini settings, which literally had paragraphs of information about huge hex maps with tons of terrain and a bunch of names on them. And for the longest time, I looked at these. I bought them all when I was a kid, and I looked at these and I couldn't figure out what the hell to do with them. I was like, where is all the stuff? There should be tons of stuff. I should have thick rule books telling me where everything is.
Right.
And it wasn't until I got older that I went, oh crap, I'm supposed to make all this stuff up.
Right, yeah.
But that there were tools to make that easier. There were tables. I could harvest other modules. I could harvest one-page dungeons, especially in today's age where there's so much material produced by the OSR and other gaming parts of the subculture, so that I could literally begin to do that. And my latest campaign has a set of rules, and it's a sandbox, and I literally sprinkle these rumors. And okay, Dan, you're right. It's true. They're probably not going to open a bakery, but they don't.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
They don't want to open a bakery.
I was going to say, query, what if one of them wanted to open a bakery in the game? Would they be able to?
You know, if they wanted to open a bakery, that's fine. I'm pretty sure that they're not going to want to.
Right, yeah.
Because it's not baked into our assumption of what's heroic.
Right.
Okay, and part of the promise is that they're going to place something that's vaguely heroic, where they're going to make choices and have maybe sacrifices, and maybe some of them are going to die. And maybe it'll be some of those deaths might be meaningless because they slept on brown mold or whatever the hell is the mold of the week.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, but there's within that sort of structure, they really can do whatever they want to do. And I specifically built this campaign so they could do whatever they want to do. They still haven't gone to the city-state of the invincible overlord, like the king of traditional city source books.
Right, yeah.
That's just full of this monumental amount of detail that you may never use. If the players go there and get their stuff and just leave. Yeah. My players refuse to go there because they've heard that it's such a scum of hive and villainy.
Right.
And they're afraid of being enslaved and losing all their gold, all of which is, at least possibly true. Yeah. But not necessarily true. I don't know what's going to happen when they get there. That depends on them.
We've talked about in the past, I think on episode 8, in fact, about like this sort of this idea of like this, this halcyon idea, like it's a world you can do whatever you want to do. You can do whatever you want to do. You can be whoever you want to be, and you can play in this big sandbox, right? And I think we kind of like landed on the side of like that's got to be very hard to do. Like, what are your techniques for keeping the sandbox like for like feeling like genuine and not like how do you if the players zig and you thought they'd zag,
Like, what do you do then?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a folder. It's filled with one-page dungeons.
Okay. Yeah.
Some of those are kind of generic. Some are not.
There's a terrific program or project that the one-page dungeon thing. Have you seen
the one-page dungeon design?
So good.
And that's exactly what I've been talking about.
A contest, right?
It's a contest. So people submit literally an adventure in a page, and it doesn't have to be a dungeon. Some people submit like hex maps, and other people submit like traveler scenarios or whatever. Right. And a lot of times it's system agnostic. Most of the time it's supposed to be system agnostic.
Yeah, I have them all. I've used a number of them.
Okay.
Fact,
yeah. So you have a stack of those, and when the players say, "Oh, I want to stop here because that sounds cool," you pull it out. When the characters are generated, or when they go into a bar, you have a bunch of rumors, and you tie those back to all those cool, for example, OSR modules you've bought. Like there's the rumor about Deathfrost Doom, or there's the rumor about the dungeon in Search of Adventure from B1, the underground palace of Rogan and Zelagar. Remember them?
Right.
All right. So
I do. Yeah. We had drinks the other day. It was amazing.
Did you? Are they doing well?
They're doing great. Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
So instead of putting them on a railroad, you basically like drop them off in Grand Central Station and let them pick which train to get on. But they're still going into a dungeon one way or another, right?
Well,
is that your greater point, Dan? That they're still dungeoning?
Well, I mean, I guess so. And like, if you're going to be dungeoning anyway, like, what's the harm in a little extra railroad?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, most of the time they've gone into the dungeon, they haven't cleared it out. They haven't stayed. They've stayed exactly as long as they want, and they said, "Okay, let's get out of here." Either because it's too dangerous, or because they got bored and they wanted to go do something else.
All right, yeah, that's fair.
All right, I didn't have to force them to stay. They weren't required to stay. Now they missed a ton of treasure that they constantly complain about.
So I suppose if you had like a planned dungeon for the session, like we're going to do, like when I run Dungeon World, there is a thing we're doing that session, right? I suppose if you did that and the characters, if your story had an arc and it depended on them getting to the giant toad statue in the middle of the dungeon and it comes alive or whatever, right? I suppose if they just like left, you'd have a pretty unsatisfying story. So I can kind of see I can see the utility in like having a lot of stuff prepared and not getting too invested in one dungeon.
Yeah, and so this is like an OSR aesthetic thing, is that the story is what happened, no matter what that happened.
That's interesting. Okay.
So that the players decide what the story is based on their action and their recollection of the action.
Okay.
That the story comes after play. That
Okay.
that the story is the result of play.
Okay. That's interesting.
And so if I have a cool toad statue with a big sort of like denouement to some things I'd been like seeding earlier in the campaign,
Right, yeah.
and if they don't get it, you know what I do? I hit them with the consequences. There are consequences to not listening to the toad statue's prophecy.
Right, yeah.
Okay. And so when they see the comets falling from the sky, destroying villages nearby, they'll go, okay, what the hell is going on? And then they'll go find somebody who could tell them what's going on. And it'll be because you did not listen to the toad god's prophecy.
Right, yeah. In Dungeon World, they have what's called grim portents. And these are things that this is probably like 50% of the GM's prep, which is, it's basically like a countdown clock or like a doom clock of like things that are going to happen. Right. And you telegraph as much whenever one of them takes place, you kind of telegraph it a little bit. You don't have to, but it's more helpful if you do. So the characters understand like, Lord Farfenel's forces are amassing outside the city walls. That may not have anything to do with me right now, but that's something that Jason thought to like reveal to us, right? So it kind of like gives them a hint of like, that's probably the thing I should go deal with, or we're going to have to deal with that at some point. It's a codification of what you're talking about, essentially, right? Like it's a codified thing.
And it's an extension of something that's very story game.
Right.
Fail forward.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Right? So you can extend that whole idea to the fact that if they didn't complete the story and there are consequences, you let those consequences play out.
You let them roll, yeah.
And then the story becomes about them dealing with the
golden opportunity, it's called in Dungeon World. Yeah, and Apocalypse World. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Awesome. That was good. So Luke Crane, there's a Luke Crane kind of episode, in Burning Wheel, Dan, I think like there are skills like baking and candle making and all those things, right? And I think I don't know if he means for it to be this way, but you could theoretically stat your character out to where that's all they're carpenters or they're
I will run that
candle
game.
makers.
That sounds rad. I'll play that game.
Run that game. You're a baker, my friend.
Awesome.
As long as I don't have to be an elf baker.
You don't have to be an elf baker. You don't have to, but there will still be magic.
You just make you make little tiny cakes that fill you up with one nibble. Cool. So I think that was probably our podcast. That was a good place to wrap up. If you would like to continue the conversation with us, or you should join our Google Plus community, just Google The Gauntlet, and we'll pop right up in the community section. If you're going to be in Houston and you'd like to join us for a game, we can be found in the Houston area meetup. Again, just search Role-Playing Games. We should pop right up. And we're one of the bigger groups, so you should see us. And if you have any thoughts you'd like to share via email, you can send an email to gauntletpodcast@gmail.com. We also have a website. I'm not going to tell you where it is because it sucks. It's no good. There's nothing on it. We've decided, so I don't know why I'm even talking about it right now. So that was our podcast. Doyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was an enjoyable evening. Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a good time.
And I just want to say, if there's anybody out there who would like to give me hate mail, well, then, you don't really have any place to send it to you, do you? Oh, well. That's a shame.
See what you did there. Yeah, a nice little good, yeah. Cool. Well, thanks again. Thanks, Dan.
Yep.
You guys have a good one.
Thank you.